Somewhere along a narrow road in northern France, in the summer of 1944, a column of German Panther tanks sat motionless beneath a canopy of trees. The crews had draped their vehicles with cut branches and netting, engines off, turrets still. They were not hiding from Mustangs or Thunderbolts. They were not hiding from Lancasters or flying fortresses. They were hiding from something far smaller, something that weighed less than a motorcycle, something that carried no bombs, no machine guns, and no rockets of its own. High above the hedgerows, buzzing softly like an insect against the summer sky, a tiny fabric-covered airplane circled in a lazy figure eight. It was barely longer than an automobile. Its engine produced 65 horsepower, less than a farm tractor. Its top speed was slower than the stall speed of every fighter plane in the German Air Force. And yet, the moment that little aeroplane appeared, the Panther crews knew exactly what would follow. They had seen it happen to other units, heard the stories passed down the chain of command from veteran tankers who had survived. Within minutes, the road would erupt in fountains of dirt and steel. Artillery shells would rain down with terrifying precision, not one or two ranging shots, but dozens of rounds arriving simultaneously from batteries hidden miles behind the American lines. The first explosion would come without warning, and then another and another, the ground heaving as if the earth itself was trying to shake them loose. The Germans had learned this lesson the hard way, paid for it in burned-out tanks and shattered men, from the deserts of North Africa to the fields of Normandy. That tiny airplane was a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, and it had become one of the most feared shapes in the sky on the Western Front. The L-4 Grasshopper was never designed for war. It began its life as the Piper J-3 Cub, a simple civilian training airplane built by the Piper Aircraft Corporation in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. William T. Piper had introduced the J-3 in 1938 as an affordable, easy-to-fly trainer for ordinary Americans who wanted to learn to take to the sky. By the height of wartime production, the factory was building Cubs at a rate of one every 20 minutes. The airplane was about as basic as powered flight could get. A high-wing monoplane built from welded steel tubing covered in doped fabric, with a tiny four-cylinder Continental engine bolted to the front. Its wingspan was 35 feet, 2.5 inches. Its overall length was 22 feet, 4.5 inches. Empty. It weighed between 680 and 765 pounds, depending on the variant. Fully loaded with fuel, pilot, and a passenger, it topped out at about 1,220 pounds. It cruised at 75 miles per hour. Its maximum speed was roughly 85 miles per hour. Its stall speed was only 38 miles per hour, meaning it could fly so slowly that a man on a fast horse might almost keep up. It could clear a 50-foot obstacle in 730 feet on takeoff and land over the same obstacle in just 470 feet, allowing it to operate from roads, cow pastures, and any reasonably flat patch of ground close behind the front line. There was nothing intimidating about it, nothing aggressive. It looked like exactly what it was, a gentle little aeroplane designed to teach beginners how to fly without scaring them to death. Between 1938 and 1944, the J-3 Cub served as the primary trainer for more than 75% of the graduates of the civilian pilot training program, which trained roughly 435,000 pilots across America. But in the years before America entered the war, a small group of forward-thinking artillerymen saw something in the Piper Cub that no one else had considered. They saw a flying observation post. Artillery had always depended on the eyes of the forward observer, the man who positioned himself close enough to the enemy to see where the shells were landing and radio corrections back to the guns. The problem was that forward observers on the ground could only see as far as the nearest hill, the nearest tree line, the nearest hedgerow. They were blind to anything beyond their own limited horizon. An airplane could see over all of that. An airplane could look down on the battlefield from 1,000 feet and spot targets that no man on the ground could ever detect. Enemy artillery batteries hidden behind a ridge. Supply columns moving along a distant road. Tank formations assembling in a forest clearing. An airplane could see all of it, and an airplane with a radio could tell the guns exactly where to shoot. The idea first took practical shape in 1936, when two Texas National Guard officers, First Lieutenant Joseph Watson Jr. and Captain George Burr, flew their personally owned Piper Cubs to direct artillery fire during their unit's summer training camp. It was an informal experiment, two artillerymen who happened to be pilots using their own airplanes to do what they knew needed doing. But the results were so promising that the concept refused to die. By 1940, during the Fourth Corps maneuvers in Louisiana, Lieutenant Watson flew a Piper Cub to direct a field artillery brigade's road march and observe for its guns from Camp Beauregard. He had no radio in the airplane, so he communicated by dropping written messages from the cockpit. It was crude, but it worked. The real breakthrough came during the massive military exercises of 1941. At the Tennessee and Louisiana maneuvers and at Fort Bliss, 12 light planes furnished free of charge by their manufacturers, complete with civilian pilots and mechanics, performed so brilliantly that they changed everything. They directed artillery fire. They scouted routes for advancing columns. They spotted enemy positions and reported them in real time. The umpires overseeing one exercise reportedly grounded the little planes halfway through because they were giving Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair's Second Army too great an advantage. Major General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the 2nd Armored Division, already flew his own personal light airplane and immediately grasped the potential. Among the officers who flew as observers during these trials was a colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who would one day command the entire Allied invasion of Europe. There was only one problem. The Army Air Corps did not want the artillery to have its own airplanes. Major General Henry H. Arnold, who commanded American military aviation, believed that all aircraft should belong to the air arm and be controlled centrally. Arnold saw the field artillery's request for organic aviation as an institutional threat, an attempt to carve off a piece of the Air Corps' territory. But the Chief of Staff of the Army, General George C. Marshall, sided with the artillerymen. Marshall understood that the air arm's fast, high-flying fighters and bombers could not provide the persistent, low-level, on-call observation that artillery needed. The Air Corps could promise occasional reconnaissance missions. The artillery needed an airplane overhead all day, every day, talking directly to the guns. When Arnold's opposition became clear, Marshall made his position plain. If Marshall wanted to give the field artillery planes, Arnold would not stop it. On June 6, 1942, exactly 2 years before the invasion of Normandy, the War Department issued the order that changed everything. Each field artillery battalion, brigade, group, and divisional artillery headquarters was authorized its own air section, equipped with 2 L-4 aircraft. The pilots would not be airmen. They would be artillerymen, trained to fly at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, wearing field artillery insignia, taking their orders from the artillery commander. The airplane belonged to the gunners. This was a revolutionary idea. No other army in the world did anything like it. The British Royal Artillery had its own air observation post squadrons flying Taylorcraft Oster aircraft, but those were administratively controlled by the Royal Air Force. The Germans had the Fieseler Storch for artillery spotting, but it was a Luftwaffe asset flown by Luftwaffe pilots under Luftwaffe orders. The Soviets kept their observation aircraft under Air Force control as well. Only the Americans placed the airplane, the pilot, and the radio under the same command that owned the guns, and that single institutional decision made all the difference. The aircraft itself was modified only slightly for its military role. The civilian yellow paint was replaced with olive drab. A wraparound greenhouse of plexiglass panels was added behind the wing, and a skylight was cut into the cabin roof to give the observer in the rear seat an unobstructed view of the ground below. The critical addition was the SCR 610 radio, an FM voice transmitter and receiver operating in the 27 to 39 MHz band with a range of about 5 miles and 2 preset crystal-controlled channels. The radio, with its batteries, weighed over 60 pounds, mounted on an observer's table behind the pilot's seat, with an 8-foot, 2-inch antenna running through a hole in the cabin roof. It allowed the airborne observer to talk directly to the Fire Direction Center on the same frequency used by the ground-forward observers in their artillery jeeps. There was no intermediate step, no relay, and no translation. The pilot spoke, and the guns responded. Many pilots compensated for the heavy radio by flying solo from the front seat, letting the rearward weight of the radio equipment keep the center of gravity within limits, since the fully loaded airplane often exceeded its certified gross weight. The Army ordered approximately 5,500 L-4s across all variants during the war, making it the most numerous American liaison aircraft of the conflict. But the L-4 was only the visible tip of a much larger system. What made American artillery the most devastating in the world was not any single weapon or any single airplane. It was the way everything worked together. At the heart of that system was the Fire Direction Center, a concept developed at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill during the 1930s under the direction of gunnery instructor Carlos Brewer. Under the old system, each battery computed its own firing data independently. Under Brewer's reforms, batteries were located on a common firing chart by survey. Targets were designated with reference to fixed base points, and all computation of firing data, range, deflection, fuse setting, propellant charge, was centralized at the battalion level. The key piece of equipment was the M1 graphical firing table, a logarithmic slide rule developed in 1940 by Captain Abbott H. Burns at Fort Sill. With this system, a single forward observer, whether on the ground or in an L4 overhead, could call for fire and have all 12 howitzers of his battalion adjusting onto the same target in 3 minutes. Division-level support could be added in roughly 3 more minutes. An entire corps of artillery could be massed in about 9 minutes. The procedure was standardized down to the last word. The observer radioed an initial call for fire with a target description and approximate location. A single ranging round was fired. The observer watched where it landed and radioed a correction. Right, 100. Drop 50. Add 200. The Fire Direction Center applied the correction and fired again. When the rounds were landing on target, the observer gave the command that every German soldier learned to dread. Fire for effect. At that command, every available tube opened fire. The workhorse of the American artillery was the M2A1, 105mm howitzer, and each infantry division had 3 battalions of them, a total of 36 tubes. The heavier 155mm howitzer, the 8-inch howitzer, and the massive 240mm howitzer rounded out the corps and army-level battalions. Any of these could be called upon by a single observer in the sky. The result was the famous time-on-target concentration, a technique originally developed by the British in the North African desert in late 1941, using BBC time signals to synchronize watches. The Americans systematized and expanded it to an art form. The firing times of multiple batteries scattered miles apart were carefully staggered so that all rounds, sometimes 100 or more from dozens of guns, landed on the target within the same 3-second window. The devastating logic was simple. Most casualties from artillery fire occur in the first few seconds, before soldiers can dive into foxholes or take cover behind walls. A wartime test demonstrated that within 2 seconds of the first shell's impact, the proportion of standing soldiers in a hasty defensive position fell from 58% to 29%. Within 8 seconds, every single man had taken cover. Time on target made those first seconds count for maximum destruction. There was no warning, no first shell to send men scrambling for shelter. The entire barrage arrived at once, a simultaneous hammer blow of high explosive and steel fragments that killed before anyone could react. The L4 pilot added 3 things to this system that no ground observer could provide. First, he could see over the next hill, the next ridge, the next hedgerow, directly observing targets that terrain hid from anyone on the ground. Second, he had the altitude to see deep behind enemy lines, locating artillery batteries, command posts, supply columns, and assembly areas miles beyond the front. Third, he was always on station and could shift fire from one target to another in seconds, simply by pressing his transmit button. In some operations, the airborne observer directed up to 95% of all the artillery fire delivered in his sector, and there was a fourth effect that no one had predicted. The mere presence of an L4 over the front line acted as a suppressor. German artillery batteries, knowing that a single ranging burst would betray their position to the cub above, frequently went completely silent for as long as the airplane remained airborne. They would wait, sometimes for hours, and fire only during the brief minutes around dawn and dusk, when the spotter was not in the sky. The system got its first combat test on November 9, 1942, during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. 3 L4s were launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Ranger, the first time American Army aircraft had ever operated from a Navy carrier. The section was led by Captain Ford E. Alcorn, who had helped lead the test squadron during the 1941 maneuvers. The debut was a near disaster. After launching from the pitching carrier deck, the three tiny grasshoppers were immediately fired upon by the American cruiser Brooklyn, whose gunnery officers had never seen a Piper Cub before and had no silhouette of one in their aircraft recognition books. Years later, one Navy officer defended himself by saying, "If you were 60 miles out to sea and saw a Cub putting by, would you believe it?" The little planes scattered through the anti-aircraft fire, only to be shot at again by American landing ships on the beach and then by Vichy French forces inland. Captain Alcorn was wounded by machine gun fire in the leg before crash landing. Lieutenant William H. Butler and his observer Captain Brenton A. Devil Jr., flying the L-4 named Elizabeth, were forced down near Vichy French lines and briefly taken prisoner. Lieutenant John R. Schell was also captured before French resistance ended. Not a single fire mission was completed that day. But the failure of that first morning was temporary. By the spring of 1943, during the Tunisian campaign, the air observation post was proving its worth beyond any doubt. Officers like Captain Delbert L. Bristol helped standardize procedures as the system matured in combat. Between April 23 and May 8, 1943, 31 aircraft flew 715 missions in northern Tunisia without losing a single man. They directed 97 artillery fire missions, flew 231 supply and courier flights, and conducted 167 reconnaissance sorties. And it was in Tunisia that the Germans first began to understand what they were facing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Axis forces in North Africa, wrote a letter to his wife on February 18, 1943, during the fighting around Kasserine Pass. In that letter, he recorded a simple but telling observation. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. It was perhaps the earliest documented recognition by a senior German officer that these little unarmed airplanes were not a nuisance. They were a weapons system. Rommel understood, even at that early stage, that the small airplane overhead was connected to something much larger and much more dangerous than itself. The system grew more effective with every campaign. For the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, the challenge was getting the short-range grasshoppers ashore fast enough to be useful. Captain Devil, drawing on his torch experience, proposed an ingenious solution. Convert a tank landing ship into an improvised aircraft carrier. In 36 hours, the Navy-manned LST-386 was fitted with a flight deck of timber topped with pierced metal landing mat. After takeoff trials on Lake Bizerte in Tunisia, 4 L-4s flew off the makeshift carrier into the Sicilian assault, while the ship still carried its normal load of vehicles in the tank deck below. The aircraft could not land back aboard, so pilots flew straight to captured airfields ashore. Several other tank landing ships received similar conversions for the Salerno and Anzio landings. From Sicily onward through the Italian campaign, the L-4s became indispensable. In the mountains of Italy, where ground observation was limited to whatever you could see from the particular ridge you happened to be standing on, the airborne observer was often the only way to find the enemy. The terrain that made Italy such a nightmare for the attacking Allies, the steep ridges, the deep valleys, the stone-walled villages perched on hilltops, it was equally a nightmare for ground-forward observers trying to see what lay on the other side of the next mountain. An L-4 circling at 1,000 feet could see into valleys that were invisible from any ground position, could spot German guns tucked into ravines, could follow supply mules climbing trails that wound through the rocks. At Salerno, at Anzio, at Cassino, at every battle up the long Italian peninsula, the little grasshoppers circled overhead, calling down fire on targets that ground observers could never have seen. At Anzio, where the beachhead was so small and flat that German artillery on the surrounding hills could see almost everything, the L-4s turned the tables by spotting the German batteries themselves, hidden in the hills above the plain, and calling counter-battery fire onto them. 5th, Army Commander Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark used a personal L-4 to inspect the battlefield at Anzio and routinely flew to subordinate command posts in one. Captain Alfred W. Schultz of the 9th Field Artillery Battalion, 3rd Infantry Division, flew his L-4B named Janie on artillery missions from the Tunisian shore in November 1942 through Sicily, Italy, southern France and into Germany, eventually carrying Patton himself on observation flights. Janie is the only intact Piper Cub known to have survived continuous combat service throughout the entire war. Then came Normandy. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, every American infantry, airborne, and armored division had an air section in each artillery battalion, all equipped with L4s. The Grasshoppers were not in the air over the beaches that morning. The cross-channel distance was beyond their range, but they were quickly assembled and flown to improvised landing strips in the beachhead, some of them nothing more than packed sand along the shore at Grand Camp-les-Bains. What followed was the campaign where the L4 proved its value beyond all argument. The bocage country of Normandy, the ancient landscape of dense hedgerows that divided every field into a fortress, made ground observation nearly worthless. A forward observer on the ground could see perhaps 200 yards in any direction before his view was blocked by the next wall of earth and vegetation. But from 500 feet up, the L4 pilot could see over all of it, the German tanks hiding in the tree lines, the assault guns waiting in ambush at crossroads, the mortar positions tucked into the corners of fields. In the first weeks after the landings, L4 pilots also adjusted naval gunfire from offshore warships, serving as the critical link between the fleet's heavy guns and targets inland. Pilots typically flew overloaded, carrying both an observer and the 25-pound radio in addition to their own weight, pushing the little airplane well beyond its certified gross weight. They searched out hidden anti-tank positions that were waiting to destroy Sherman tanks as they crashed through gaps blown in the hedgerows. Every field was a potential killing ground, and the only way to see the trap before the tanks rolled into it was from the air. The Grasshopper pilots developed an intimate knowledge of their sectors, flying the same ground day after day, learning every lane, every orchard, and every farmstead where the Germans might hide a gun or a mortar. They became the eyes of their divisions in a landscape specifically designed by centuries of Norman farming to blind anyone standing on the ground. German officers on the Normandy front were learning the same lesson that Rommel had discovered in Tunisia, but now on a vastly larger and more devastating scale. Rommel himself, now commanding Army Group B in France, wrote in his front reports of June 1944 that the enemy had complete command of the air over the battle area up to about 100 kilometers behind the front and cut off by day practically all traffic on the roads. He added in a separate assessment that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, had broken the front open. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armoured formations in the German army, described his division being systematically torn apart by observed artillery fire during the Normandy fighting. Every attempt to concentrate forces for a counterattack was spotted from the air and shattered by shell fire before it could begin. When the great breakout came at St. Lo in late July, Operation Cobra Bayerlein described the cumulative devastation in stark terms. His well-dug-in infantry was smashed in their foxholes and dugouts. The entire bombed area was transformed into cratered fields in which no human being was alive. The German response to the L4 was both simple and devastating in its implications. Whenever a Grasshopper appeared overhead, German artillery batteries simply stopped firing. They sat silent behind their camouflage and waited, sometimes for hours, only daring to fire during the brief windows around dawn and dusk when no spotter was aloft. Because they knew that any muzzle flash or puff of smoke would be spotted instantly from above, and within minutes every American gun within range would be pouring fire onto that position. American infantry and tank crews came to recognize the Cub's appearance as a near guarantee of immediate quiet on the enemy's side. The airplane's mere presence over the battlefield silenced the enemy's guns without firing a shot itself. This effect was compounded by something the Germans simply could not match: the sheer volume of American ammunition and firepower. American factories shipped more than 23 million rounds of 105mm ammunition during the war. American divisional artillery alone could fire 50 to 100 rounds per gun per hour. German batteries, by contrast, were being rationed to a few rounds per day by late 1944. American gunners frequently fired more rounds in a single corps, time on target concentration than a German division could fire in an entire week. And in late 1944, the Americans introduced the proximity fuse, designated VT for variable time, which allowed artillery shells to burst as airbursts roughly 15 yards above the ground. The fragments sprayed downward into trenches and foxholes that direct impact shells could not reach. Combined with the observed fire directed from an L4 overhead, This new fuse made it possible to destroy entrenched positions that had previously been almost impervious to artillery. The L4 was the front end of an industrial killing machine that had no equal on Earth. During the Great Breakout from Normandy, in late July and August of 1944, the Grasshoppers flew almost continuously ahead of American armored columns racing across France. They called fire on German rear guards blocking the roads. They warned tank commanders of ambushes waiting around the next bend. They spotted the long German columns retreating eastward through the closing Falaise pocket and directed artillery onto them throughout the daylight hours. The Falaise pocket became one of the great killing grounds of the war. Roads were choked with the wreckage of German vehicles, horses and men, much of it destroyed by artillery fire called in from the little airplanes circling overhead. Columns that might have escaped under cover of darkness were caught in daylight because they could not move fast enough, and the L4s found them every time the sun was up. Major General John S. Wood, commanding the 4th Armored Division, used Grasshoppers not just for fire direction but as personal command aircraft, flying to Corps headquarters for verbal orders and ferrying column commanders forward to scout their own routes from the air. The pursuit across France moved so fast that the L4s sometimes had to relocate their landing strips 2 or 3 times in a single day, just to stay within range of the advancing spearheads. Among the men flying those missions was the most remarkable L4 pilot of the entire war. Major Charles Carpenter was a 32-year-old former history teacher from Moline, Illinois. Born on August 29, 1912, he had been educated at the Roosevelt Military Academy in Aledo and Center College in Danville, Kentucky, and was teaching history and coaching at Moline High School when he was commissioned a second lieutenant in 1942. Carpenter was frustrated by the L4's passive role. He wanted to do more than just watch and report. So, with the help of an ordnance technician and his crew chief, he began bolting M1 Bazooka rocket launchers to his airplane's wing struts, wired through the cockpit so he could fire them with electrical switches. He started with 2, worked up to 4, and finally settled on 6, 3 under each wing. He later upgraded to the M9 launcher, firing the M6, a 3 high-explosive anti-tank rocket, which could penetrate the top armor of even heavy tanks. He named the airplane Rosie the Rocketer, a tribute to the home front icon Rosie the Riveter. Carpenter's most celebrated mission came during the Battle of Aricourt in September 1944. The German 5th Panzer Army had counterattacked Patton's overstretched 4th Armored Division near Nancy in eastern France. On September 20, 1944, with several American support units pinned down by advancing Panther tanks, Carpenter took off through low fog. When the fog lifted around noon, he attacked the German column, diving through a hail of ground fire to launch all 6 bazookas. He returned to his landing strip, reloaded, and flew 2 more attack sorties that afternoon. He fired 16 bazooka rockets in total, and was credited with destroying or disabling 2 Panther tanks and several armored cars, helping force the German formation to retreat and saving the trapped American units. A Stars and Stripes reporter named Earl Mazzo made Carpenter famous with a dispatch published on November 6, 1944. He became known on both sides of the front as Bazooka Charlie. Carpenter told the reporter something that perfectly captured the shift in German attitudes toward the Cub. Word must be getting around among those krauts to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit. By war's end, Carpenter was officially credited with destroying 6 German tanks, including 2 Tigers, and several other armored vehicles. General Patton personally awarded him the Silver Star, reportedly saying he was the kind of fighting man he wanted in his army. Carpenter also received the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster and the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. But Carpenter's bazooka-armed Grasshopper was the exception. Most pilots who tried mounting bazookas concluded quickly that diving a frail fabric airplane into a hail of German small arms fire was, as one wartime report put it, extremely unhealthy. The vast majority of L4 pilots fought their war the way the system was designed, unarmed, circling above the front lines with nothing between them and the enemy but fabric and a prayer. And the cost of even that mission was staggering. In June and July of 1944 alone, the 1st United States Army lost 49 artillery observation aircraft and 33 pilots in just 8 weeks. Across the entire European campaign, More than 2,700 Letter 4s served with the field artillery, and nearly 900 of them, roughly a third of the entire fleet, were lost to enemy action and accidents combined. The danger came primarily from ground fire. The L4 had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a fabric skin that offered no protection from even rifle-caliber bullets. A single 20mm anti-aircraft round was usually enough to bring one down. Pilots reduced the risk by flying low, rarely above 800 feet, hugging the terrain, jinking constantly, never silhouetting themselves against the skyline. They flew in figure-8 patterns over their targets to make themselves harder to track. As one veteran pilot put it, "We flew low and slow. If we flew higher than 800 feet, we would be bait for German fighters." Enemy fighter attacks were rarer but lethal when they came. On October 21, 1944, 3 Messerschmitt 109s attacked Lieutenant Darwin P. Garrard of the 320th Glider Field Artillery Battalion over the Netherlands. His L4 was hit, but somehow remained flyable, and infantry on the ground shot down one of the Messerschmitts. In March 1945, Captain John W. Gordon of the 65th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion was shot down over the Rhine by a German fighter, but managed a successful crash landing. Then, on April 11, 1945, came one of the strangest air combat engagements of the entire war. First Lieutenants Merritt D. Francis and William S. Martin of the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, 5th Armoured Division, encountered a Luftwaffe Fieseler Storch near Dannenberg, Germany. Flying their L4H nicknamed Miss Me, Francis dove on the Storch from above. He and Martin emptied their issue. M1911 45 caliber pistols at the German airplane, hit its windshield and fuel tank, and forced it to land. Both aircraft came down. The Americans took the German crew prisoner at gunpoint and handed them to a passing armoured column. It is widely cited as one of the last air-to-air victories of the European war, and certainly the only one in which the winners used service pistols. The contrast between the American and German approaches to artillery observation explains why the L4 was so effective and why the Germans could never replicate its success. The Luftwaffe operated the Fieseler Storch, a superb short takeoff and landing aircraft first flown in 1936 and produced in numbers approaching 3,000. On paper, the Storch was far superior to the Grasshopper. It had a 240 horsepower engine, more than 3 times the power of the L4. Its wingspan was nearly 47 feet. Full-span leading-edge slats and slotted flaps gave it an astonishing stall speed of about 31 miles per hour. It could land and take off from absurdly short strips. But the Storch was a Luftwaffe airplane, not an artillery airplane. It was issued in modest numbers across reconnaissance and liaison squadrons rather than assigned organically, 2 per battalion, to artillery units the way the L4 was. Many Storches were absorbed as personal transports for senior officers. Rommel, Kesselring, Goering and the Commando Otto Skorzeny all used Storches as personal runabouts. The airplane that should have been serving the guns was instead serving the generals. And by 1944, the collapse of the Luftwaffe meant that even the Storches still available for artillery spotting had no fighter cover. The fundamental difference was institutional. German artillery observation collapsed because it depended on the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe was being destroyed. American artillery observation grew stronger every month because it depended on the field artillery itself. When the German Ardennes offensive began on December 16, 1944, fog and low clouds initially grounded most air observation posts. The weather that shielded the German advance also blinded American artillery. Only 2 L4s of the 42nd Field Artillery Battalion managed to get airborne on the first day. Airstrips of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions were overrun, their pilots abandoning aircraft and escaping on foot as German tanks rolled through their positions. The absence of the L4s was felt immediately. Without eyes in the sky, American artillery was firing blind, relying entirely on ground observers whose view was blocked by the dense Ardennes forests and the fog that hung in the valleys. For 2 critical days, the advantage swung to the Germans precisely because the system that had made American gunnery so lethal was grounded by weather. On December 18, 1st Army Air Section pilots who managed to get aloft ran out of artillery targets in their sector and began directing P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers instead. Pioneering an early form of forward air control, that would become standard practice in future wars. When the weather finally cleared on December 23, the L-4s returned to the sky with a vengeance. Around the besieged town of Bastogne, air observation post pilots directed the massed fires that broke one German attack after another against the thin defensive perimeter. The desperately outnumbered defenders, including the 101st Airborne Division and supporting artillery battalions, depended on observed artillery fire to break up German armoured thrusts before they could overwhelm their positions. On Christmas Eve, First Lieutenant Kenneth B. Shelley of the 28th Infantry Division flew a load of penicillin into encircled Bastogne in his L4, threading his way through German anti-aircraft fire to deliver desperately needed medical supplies to the surrounded garrison. Ski-equipped L4s of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion flew artillery missions from icy clearings near Spa, Belgium, their crews taxiing back and forth along improvised runways to pack the snow firm enough for takeoff in temperatures well below freezing. The senior German commanders who planned the Ardennes offensive later confirmed the devastating effectiveness of the integrated American system. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, attributed his failure substantially to Allied tactical air power. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall German commander in the West, named his own lack of fighters and reconnaissance aircraft and the tremendous tactical air power of the Allies as the chief cause of the offensive's collapse. As the war entered its final months in 1945, the L-4s flew across the Roer, the Rhine, and deep into the heart of Germany itself. Every river crossing, every town, every pocket of resistance was observed from above and subjected to the full weight of American artillery. German units that tried to form defensive lines found those lines broken before they could consolidate, because the little airplane overhead saw the positions being dug and called fire before the first machine gun was emplaced. The war that had begun with 3 confused Piper Cubs being shot at by their own navy off the coast of Morocco ended with hundreds of them ranging freely over a collapsing Reich, directing the fire of the most powerful artillery force ever assembled. The men who flew these missions came home to resume the ordinary lives the war had interrupted. Charles Carpenter returned to teaching history, this time at Urbana High School in Urbana, Illinois. He had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease in early 1945 and was given 2 years to live. He defied that prognosis for 21 years, teaching and coaching until his death on March 22, 1966, at the age of 53. His airplane survived as well. Sold as surplus in Europe after the war, Rosie, the Rocketer, passed through several owners, was repainted civilian yellow, registered as the second civilian aircraft in the reformed nation of Austria, and served for years as a glider tug. In 2017, researchers identified the airplane in the storage of the Austrian Aviation Museum at Graz Airport. It was acquired by the Collings Foundation and restored to its 1944 combat configuration by Colin Powers of Lapine, Oregon. During the restoration, bullet holes were found in the original airframe, and signatures of the Piper factory workers who built it in Lock Haven were discovered on the wooden wing spars. Carpenter's granddaughter, Erin Putter, repainted the Rosie the Rocketer nose art. The airplane now flies in airworthy condition at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. Captain Schultz's L-4B Janey also survives, the only Piper Cub known to have flown continuously in combat from Operation Torch in November 1942 through VE Day in May 1945. Surviving L-4s and L-5s can be found in museums across America. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Dayton, Ohio, displays a Grasshopper. The Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum displays a Piper J-3 Cub at its Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, alongside other wartime liaison aircraft in its collection. Private owners and groups like the Alamo Liaison Squadron keep fleets of surviving Grasshoppers and Sentinels in flying condition, performing memorial flyovers at military ceremonies. The institutional legacy of the L-4 proved even more enduring than the surviving airframes. The field artillery's wartime victory in keeping its organic aviation created the precedent that allowed the United States Army, after the Air Force became a separate service in 1947, to retain and develop its own fleet of aircraft and, eventually, of helicopters. The observation pilots of 1942, who fought the Army Air Corps for the right to fly their own airplanes, were the institutional ancestors of today's Army aviation branch. The concept of the modern forward air controller, the officer who calls in close air support from above the battlefield, traces directly back to those first Army pilots in the Ardennes on December 18, 1944, who found no more ground targets to engage and started guiding fighter bombers instead. The L-4 Grasshopper carried no bombs. It dropped no torpedoes. For most of its service, it mounted no weapons at all. It was a 65-horsepower, fabric-covered airplane that any student pilot could have flown on a calm Sunday morning. But it was the instrument through which American artillery found its targets. It was the eye that guided the fist. And when German officers looked up at that tiny silhouette circling above the hedgerows, they understood something profound. They were not seeing a harmless little airplane. They were seeing the full destructive power of the United States Army aimed directly at them. Those pilots earned modest recognition, silver stars and air medals rather than medals of honor. They lived like infantry, sleeping in foxholes, unwashed and unshaved, eating cold rations out of cans. They flew from dawn to dusk over some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth, in an airplane made of welded steel tubes and doped fabric with no armor and no guns. They were artillerymen who happened to fly. Teachers and farmers and clerks who learned to pilot a Piper Cub at Fort Sill and then took that Cub to war across 3 continents. They did not seek glory. They sought targets. And every target they found became a target destroyed. The little Piper that the Germans first noticed as an unfamiliar silhouette over Kasserine Pass in February 1943 turned out to be something none of them had imagined. A new way of waging war that connected the eye in the sky to the guns on the ground with a speed and precision no army had ever achieved. The German officers, who realized that small American planes controlled big guns, were recognizing a truth that would reshape military thinking for generations. The most dangerous weapon is not always the largest, the fastest, or the most heavily armed. Sometimes it is simply the one that can see.